in the basement of St. Helena Cathedral, in the guardroom outside Knisgate. Leonard Mitchell was leaning on the back of his chair, his legs were propped up on the table. His eyes were vacant without any focus. Even though he had been healed using ritualistic magic, he still looked terrible, as if he had obtained reprieve from a severe illness without fully recovering. At the moment, the powerful beyond sent by the Holy Cathedral were creating another seal behind the Knisgate since the ashes of St. Helena was lost. They had conflicting opinions, some wanting to fill in the gap of power using a new holy item, while the others believed that there was no need to go through all the trouble. After all, to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, holy items were rare and incredibly precious. What they suggested was lowering the presence of the Nitorks in Tingen and transferring the artifacts with living characteristics or difficult-to-seal artifacts to their headquarters at the Cathedral of Serenity in Backlands Diocese, only leaving behind those that could be controlled more easily. They intended to send a telegram to propose a meeting of the higher-ups, to get a vote from the archbishops and high-ranking deacons. Leonard was uninterested in this debate. He felt as if he had become a living corpse, with no sorrow, grief, agitation, or excitement. He was abnormally numb. He didn't want to face anyone. All he wanted was to stay alone in the corner. Occasionally, he would feel puzzled about why the murderer would only take away lines beyond the characteristic and leave Captain Dunn Smith's one intact. Thud, thud, thud. Footsteps reverberated in the corridor. Seacatron, whose right arm had been bandaged, appeared at the door of the guardroom. While Klein and the others were attacking Megos and attempting to save Tingen City, she and the keepers within Knisgate were doing battle against a portion of the sealed artifacts. If it wasn't for the timely arrival of the members of the mandated Punishers and the machinery hive mind, or the eventual arrival of the reinforcements from the Holy Cathedral, she also might have lost her life. But even so, the elderly keeper failed to last until the end. He fought to his death, under the call of duty. Leonard, I found an unencrypted telegram in the captain's office. It was sent over by the Holy Cathedral, Seacatron said. Leonard's green eyes moved slightly, finally coming to life. He faintly recalled the sound of a new telegram coming in, but the battle was about to begin. He and Klein didn't have the time to pay attention to it. What does it say? Leonard noticed that his tone was unusually raspy. The white-haired and black-eyed Seacatron replied without hesitation, beware of Int Zangwill. Beware of sealed artifact 0-08. Int Zangwill, the archbishop that betrayed the church, the gatekeeper who failed his advancement, sealed artifact 0-08. An ordinary-looking cool Leonard muttered at first as he searched his memories, then he tilted his head to the side. He suddenly narrowed his eyes, the dispirited feelings and sadness disappeared from his body. So that's how it was. Leonard pulled his feet back and stood up, his green eyes burning with passion. He looked at Seacatron and said, I intend to apply to join the Red Gloves. The Red Gloves was a code name for the elite team of Nitorks. Under normal circumstances, Nitork teams were situated locally and had regions under their jurisdiction. They were not permitted to capture criminals outside of their area of jurisdiction without permission. As such, some evildoers would change their location after every crime, making it terribly inconvenient for the Nitorks. To deal with this, the Church of the Evernight Goddess set up the Red Gloves. They were carefully selected elites, some even possessing incomplete holy items. Their mission was to reinforce Nitork teams that had called for help, as well as track down and arrest evildoers without any restrictions. In some circles, they were also called pursuers or hunting dogs. Red Gloves, but their lowest requirement is sequence 7. Besides, the dangers the Red Gloves face are many times higher than an ordinary Nitork squad, Seacatron said in concern and doubt. Leonard smiled coldly. I'm close to advancing soon. His eyes became cold, he clenched his teeth and said to himself, I want revenge. Int Zangwill, you must live until the day I become powerful enough. All right, Seeker seemed to have guessed Leonard's thoughts. She sighed, almost half of our team will be new faces. It's rare to see a Nitork team become so ravaged. Leonard's expression darkened. He clenched his teeth and asked, are the bodies ready? Yes, Seeker nodded indiscernibly. Leonard suddenly stepped towards the door. I'll notify their families. I'll deal with the scene I don't want to deal with the most. I'll do it. At 2 Daffodil Street, Melissa sat on the sofa, inspecting the 3 tickets in her hands. She was looking at the words, the printed date, and the seat numbers. Benson was sitting beside her, observing his sister with a smile. He had a relaxed posture. Suddenly, they heard the doorbell. Ding dong, ding dong. Melissa glanced at their busy maid Bella, then she took the 3 tickets with her and stood up, looking a little confused. She briskly ran to the door. Her black hair was shinier than it was before, her face no longer skinny. The color of her skin had a ruddy color, and her brown eyes looked brighter and energetic. Twisting the handle and opening the door, Melissa froze for a moment. She didn't recognize their visitor. It was a young man with black hair and green eyes. He looked handsome, but his face was unusually pale. Hidden in his eyes was deep sorrow. May I know who you are? Melissa asked, feeling somewhat lost. Leonard had specially draped a black formal coat over his white shirt. He said in a raspy voice, I'm a colleague of your brother Klein. Melissa's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She instinctively tiptoed to look behind Leonard, but didn't notice anything. She said with a strange quiver in her voice, where's Klein? Leonard closed his eyes, inhaling as he said, I'm very sorry, your brother Klein died at the hands of an evil criminal while he was trying to save others. He's a hero, a true hero. Melissa widened her eyes slowly, her body shaking indiscernibly. The 3 tickets in her hands dropped helplessly onto the floor. The tickets faced upward, revealing the name of the play, The Return of the Count. Sitting in the Moretti family's living room, Leonard didn't dare to look directly at Melissa and Benson. But he couldn't stop scenes of what they looked like from flashing through his mind. That girl filled with youthfulness and vibrancy had her eyes wide open. She didn't speak, and her eyes were unfocused. Her silence made her appear like a puppet. The man who looked a little like Klein maintained a normal posture, but he would slip into a daze from time to time. His words came out slowly. That's the gist of the matter. I'm very sorry that I was unable to prevent it in a timely manner. The Blackthorn Security Company, the police department, and those that he helped have promised a bereavement compensation of about £6,000, Leonard said, as his eyes darted around. Suddenly, Benson interrupted him. His voice was hoarse as he asked, where's his body? I'm asking where's Klein's body. He puckered his lips and paused. When can we see him? In the company. You can see him now, Leonard answered, unable to mask his grief. All right. Benson moved his rigid lips with great difficulty. Let me use the bathroom first. Without waiting for Leonard's reply, he quickly entered the bathroom and slammed the door closed. He stood in front of the sink and turned on the tap, allowing the water to flow. He bent down and repeatedly splashed water onto his face. As he did that, his actions came to a sudden stop. Nothing changed for a long time, leaving only the sound of running water reverberating in the bathroom. A few minutes later, Benson lifted his head and looked into the mirror. He saw that his face was covered in water droplets. The redness in his eyes was impossible to hide now. A few days later, in a corner of the Raphael Cemetery. After finishing Dunn's funeral, the crowd gathered before a new tombstone. On it was Klein's black and white photograph, a very scholarly photograph. Melissa stood before the grave, her eyes without focus. Beside her, Elizabeth kept wiping away her tears. Leonard, Benson, Fry, and Bredt carried the coffin and walked over, lowering the coffin into the grave. After the priest gave the eulogy and individual prayers, the grave was filled with soil, covering the black coffin bit by bit. At this moment, Melissa knelt down and tossed in the copper whistle she found on her brother's body. Leonard turned and looked at the scene, his heart wincing. However, he admired how strong this girl was. He knew that this girl didn't cry after receiving the bad news. Instead, she stayed pitifully quiet. The grave was leveled and the stone slab was laid over it. Leonard took a final look at Klein's tombstone. There were 3 lines to his epitaph. The best elder brother, the best younger brother, the best colleague. Under the mournful atmosphere, the members of the Blackthorn Security Company gradually left. Selena and Elizabeth also bade farewell under the urging of their families. The only people left behind were Benson and Melissa. I'll get a rental carriage. Benson was in a terrible condition. It was as if he hadn't slept for a long time. All right, Melissa nodded. After seeing her brother leave, she turned to look at the tombstone. She squatted down and buried her face in her arms. After some silence, Melissa suddenly scolded, "Stupid." She cried as she wept silently. Her tears just wouldn't stop. Nighttime, at the Raphael Cemetery. The copper-skinned Zyke stood in front of Klein's grave holding a bouquet of white flowers. He didn't speak for the longest time until he finally sighed and muttered to himself, "I'm sorry, I was 10 minutes late. But I think I know who it was." He bent over and set the bouquet of flowers down before turning to leave the cemetery. He also left Timjan, but he didn't retrieve the copper whistle. The place was quiet and serene under the illumination of the crimson moonlight. Suddenly, the stone slab sealing the grave was flipped open. A pale hand extended out from the soil. A hand came out. Whoosh! The gravestone was shoved aside. The lid of the coffin was pushed open. Klein sat upright and looked around, lost. His memory was still frozen at the scene with the brand new leather boots and the palm that grabbed onto the urn of St. Selena's ashes. Everything after it felt like a dreamless sleep. Klein instinctively lowered his head and unbuttoned his shirt. He looked at the left side of his chest, only to see that his ravaged injury and missing heart were squirming as they healed, similar to how he recovered from the bullet wound through his temple back when he looked into the mirror. The only difference was that this time, the recovery was much slower and much more difficult. In the northern part of the Loam Kingdom, the September breeze, that had an additional coldness to it, howled through the cemetery. It was even gloomier and colder than usual. The cold jolted Klein back to his senses as he muttered with a rueful smile, "It looks like there are still some secrets behind my transmigration. But it seems like I'll only be able to resurrect another 2 times at most, not anymore, and if I were to minced up or completely crushed. Who knows if this recovery ability that doesn't usually appear would even be useful." After half a minute, Klein buttoned his suit and realized that he was wearing his newest shirt and tuxedo, but they were now covered in soil and dirt. Benson and Melissa really have no idea how to save money, the thought popped into his head. He supported his weight on his hand and flipped up into a standing position, realizing that he still had his clown abilities. The best elder brother, the best younger brother, the best colleague. Klein looked at his tombstone and read the inscription. He felt his heart wince, seemingly sensing the despondent feelings Melissa and Benson had experienced. "This is probably even more depressing than watching Captain die before my eyes," he sighed and retracted his gaze. He squatted down and closed the coffin lid. His thoughts were still scattered, but Klein knew that he had to take care of the scene as soon as possible and not let anyone notice. Resurrection wasn't something any commoner could accept. If the net talks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hive mind learned of this, Klein believed that he wouldn't have a great ending. Of course, if it was on Earth, he could deceive the people into believing that he was the blessed one of God, the man of salvation, had he consumed the lawyer or swindler potions. However, in the world he was in, there was a real God that could respond to rituals. He scraped the soil back together and covered it with the stone slab. Klein clapped his hands and stood up once again. At that moment, the scene didn't appear strange. He was just like a gentleman who came to offer his condolences late at night. The only oddity was that the person in the photo on the tombstone looked exactly like him. During the process of filling his grave, his spirituality noticed the existence of Zyke's copper whistle. Hence, he dug it out and wiped it clean. However, Klein didn't intend to summon the messenger immediately. He decided to figure out the situation first. Klein lifted his left hand and saw the topaz pendant that was still wrapped around his wrist. "I guess this is considered a burial object." He gave a self-deprecating laugh and took off the pendulum. He looked around, and his face grew solemn. "Captain should be buried in this cemetery as well, I guess." He changed directions twice and finally determined the location of Dunn's tombstone using the pendulum. With the moonlight's aid, Klein walked around and searched for about 15 minutes until he finally saw Captain's monochrome photo. It had a gentle expression, high hairline, grey eyes, nothing unusual compared to before. Under Dunn's photo was his name, date of birth, date of death, and epitaph. The true guardian, the most trusted partner. The captain forever. Klein looked in stunned silence, and somehow his sight grew blurry for some baffling reason. He felt as though he had returned to that day again. He saw the captain turn his head to him and wink. He spoke with a mellow and relaxed voice. "We saved Timjan." Captain Klein shouted in silence. He stood there like a statue for a good few minutes until he suddenly said with a smile, "Captain, your mental state was definitely not the best that day. You even said things like you could bring old Neil into the dreamland if he hadn't lost control. He was a mystery prior, and you're a nightmare. You couldn't consume the beyond the characteristic that he left behind. Yes, you didn't ask me what powerful offensive attacks I had. Was it trust, or did you forget about it? But you definitely guessed something. I only took one sealed artifact and said it was for Leonard. Even without a brain, you could have guessed that I had the extra means for a powerful attack." Having said that, Klein paused, then he shook his head and sighed. "I have no idea what I am now. Maybe I'm just an evil spirit that has clawed its way back from hell to seek revenge." As he spoke, he suddenly stopped. His tears streamed down his cheeks and finally, he shouted softly with a choking voice, "Captain, we miss you too." Klein felt the cold breeze blow past him as he lifted his hands to wipe his tears and blow his nose. He became silent again and found a hidden spot nearby. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the world above the grey fog. He wanted to find the person that killed him with the aid of divination. He wanted to know the murderer who triggered all of this. As he's already appeared before me, I'm sure that I can divine some information. Klein pursed his lips tightly together and saw the lofty palace and ancient mottled table as usual. He took the seat that belonged to the fool. A yellowish-brown goatskin and fountain pen appeared before him. Since his physical body in reality was under limited protection, Klein didn't delay and wrote down his divination statement after a moment's thought. The person who killed me. He recited it 7 times and leaned back into the chair. He entered his dream with the aid of cogitation. In the blurry world, there were countless points of light dancing and gathering. In the end, they formed a scene. A pair of brand new leather boots, a pair of slightly pale hands, and the Saint Selena's urn that was held by those hands. He looked up, and Klein saw a middle-aged man with short, dark blonde hair. He wore a black 2-button suit, and one of his eyes was obviously blind, while the other one was so blue that it was almost black. His facial features were like carvings, and his face had no wrinkles at all. The image shattered, and Klein woke up from his dream. His eyebrows were tightly knitted. He found his murderer very familiar. As a seer, he quickly understood why he found the person familiar. It was because he had seen the man's photo on a wanted notice. The murderer was Zangwill. He was the former archbishop of the Church of the Ebonite Goddess who took sealed artifact 0-08. He had failed to advance as a gatekeeper. It's him. Countless images flashed through Klein's head, and they finally stopped on the scene when Zangwill picked up Saint Selena's urn. Tap, tap, tap. Klein extended his hands and rapped the edge of the long bronze table. He felt that he suddenly understood many things. The captain said that a beyonder that dies normally would leave behind a beyonder characteristic. When gathered together, they're equivalent to a potion that lacks the supplementary ingredients. In other words, as long as one knows the corresponding supplementary ingredients, they can advance using remains. Of course, one cannot consume beyond their level, as it would easily lead to a loss of control or going insane. Becoming a high-sequence beyonder would require the accompaniment of some special ritual. That was mentioned in the incomplete unshadowed formula. The subsequent advancements would require a ritual as well. Zangwill is a gatekeeper, a sequence 5 from the Def sequence pathway. He wanted to become a high-sequence beyonder, a demigod. Based on the situation allowed by the exchanging of sequences, he had 3 choices. One was obviously sequence 4 in the Def sequence pathway, second was sequence 4 in the Sleepless sequence pathway, and third was sequence 4 in the God of Combat sequence pathway, Demon Hunter. Saint Selena was a saint. She was either sequence 4 or sequence 3. Her urn corresponds to one of the 2 sequence potions. Zangwill, who was a former archbishop, definitely knew exactly which one she was. And he definitely knew to require supplementary ingredients. Was his true motive in planning all of this to get Saint Selena's ashes and advance to sequence 4 in the Sleepless pathway? The Skull of Death's descendant, that might be an ingredient needed for the special ritual. It was from the Def sequence pathway, after all. From the looks of it, his target was the captain, and not me. He really was the mastermind behind all this. Having figured this out, Klein wrote down a corresponding divination statement. He took his pendulum and let the topaz hang above the surface of the paper. After he recited the statement, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise. It meant that the information he provided was sufficient, and the divination was successful. It meant that Zangwill had really plotted the series of events in order to get Saint Selena's ashes to advance to sequence 4. Klein rapped on the edge of the table again as he mulled over a different question. Zangwill was merely a sequence 5 gatekeeper. Relying on him alone would make it impossible for him to create so many coincidences. For instance, for Megos to follow his arrangements and visit the talks at the correct time. So, is it the power of sealed artifact 0-08? Its appearance is that of an ordinary quill. Its function is to write down events that are bound to happen. No, it couldn't be that easy otherwise. Zangwill could write that Saint Selena's urn grew a pair of wings and flew into his hands. Then, he could have just waited at home. There must be certain restrictions. 0-08 most likely doesn't possess direct combat ability. Otherwise, Zangwill could have stormed through Canis Gate in Tingen. As one of the most dangerous sealed artifacts, perhaps it can let people act according to its description without realizing it. That was the reason behind all the coincidences. If it's really true, then 0-08 is quite terrifying. Even Megos, who was pregnant with the son of an evil god, adhered to its arrangements. No wonder grade 0 sealed artifacts are extremely dangerous. They're of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. They're not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Klein stopped rapping the edge of the table. He divined his earlier guess, but, unfortunately, it failed due to a lack of information. He saw that a few minutes had passed, and he planned to return to the real world as soon as possible. Hence, he didn't let his thoughts run wild but wrote down the penultimate divination statement. The city where Zangwill currently is. Due to the existence of sealed artifact 0-08 and the fact that Zangwill had likely become a demigod, Klein couldn't divine his exact location directly. He could only make a rough inquiry of the general area. Of course, if there wasn't a mysterious space like the world above the grey fog to eliminate disturbances, he would definitely fail in divination, even if it was a rough inquiry. He leaned against the high back chair and recited the divination statement 7 times. He dreamed again and entered the blurry world. The blurry world suddenly cracked, and there was a wide river which was slightly murky. There was a grand bridge above the river. Both banks had ports lined one after another. There were many goods and many workers. To the northeast of the river, there were rows upon rows of houses. Most of them had the Lower Kingdom's present-day architectural styles, such as polygenic roofs, oriel windows, and no veranda by the street. Other than that, there was a lot of Gothic architecture. The streets were filled with people and carriages. From time to time, strange machinery could be seen. The farther east he went, the more chimneys there were and the smokier it got. When he headed west, the elevation rose, and there were houses in greyish-blue, beige, and light yellow that spiraled up opulent castles and Gothic clock towers. Gong. The chime of a clock sounded and snapped Klein back to his senses. He knew which city he had seen. The land of hope, and the city of cities, Backland. So Zangwill has gone to Backland. I wonder how long he'll stay there. Yes, I should confirm this every now and then. Klein leaned forward as he thought. He erased the contents on the goatskin and wrote a new divination statement. Lanivas's current location. From his point of view, the person that caused the captain him to nearly die was undoubtedly Zangwill. But the lunatic Lanivas was definitely an accomplice who cannot shirk from the responsibility. He had to pay the price in blood. After reciting the statement 7 times, Klein once again entered the dream. But the scene that appeared after the foggy world shattered was the same as the one he had seen before. A wide, slightly murky river, countless piers and buildings. The buildings were primarily in the present Loan architectural style, some a little more Gothic. There were crowded streets, flourishing sites, chimneys that continually spewed smoke. There were opulent castles standing tall with the trademark Gothic clock towers. Lanivas was also in the land of hope, the city of cities, Backland. Klein opened his eyes, a little confused. He had divined for Lanivas's specific location, but the results were still a very general, vague region. This tells me that Lanivas's sequence must be much higher than I imagined. No, it could also be that he's received a large benefit from helping the son of the true creator descend upon this world. For example, a little godhood characteristics, or some object similar to the placenta left behind by Megos as baby, whom the latter would most likely have been taken away by Zangwill. Thoughts ran through Klein's mind as he muttered to himself whilst he made initial assumptions. After confirming the rough area where both his enemies were, he thought about another problem. He still didn't have the ability to exact revenge. Even if Lanivas is only a sequence 7, or even 8, it wouldn't be easy to deal with him if he did indeed receive a large benefit. Lanivas is also obviously very crafty. He could outwit and defeat beyond as more powerful than himself. Zangwill is even more terrifying. He's a sequence 4 demigod, and he wields a powerful grade 0 sealed artifact. Although there were some secrets surrounding my transmigration, it's clear that I can't convert those secrets into combat strength. It's likely that it's not possible for a very long period of time. The only means that I have are to continue raising my sequence, or I could collect even more powerful mystical items. I have to use both the methods at the same time. In between his thoughts, Klein decided to add another divination. He deliberated on the statement before writing solemnly, "My opportunities of becoming powerful." He gently placed the pen on the table and leaned back, then he closed his eyes. He recited the statement silently and fell into a deep sleep with the help of cogitation. In the foggy world, he once again saw the scene that he had previously seen. The river, piers, chimneys, crowds, castles, various machinery, and Gothic clock towers. He had once again seen the capital of the Loan Kingdom, Backland. Immediately following that, the scene changed. He saw a magnificent peak piercing through the clouds, and, on it, he saw a majestic, ancient palace. He saw the giant throne carved from stone, adorned with dull gems and gold. He saw a strange vertical pupil formed from countless mysterious symbols. The scene shattered silently without warning. Klein slowly sat up and tapped on the edge of the table with his fingers. Backland contains the opportunities for me to become powerful. Does the second scene refer to the main peak of the Hornus Ice Mountain range, the treasures left behind by the Antigonus family? The strange vertical pupil formed by countless mysterious symbols which the misfortuned cloth puppet conveyed to me through the corruption from the Antigonus family's notebook is the key to beginning. All of this. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Klein decided that he was in no rush to visit the Hornus Ice Mountain range. Even a sequence 4 demigod might not be able to deal with the dangers that resided there. I guess I'll head to Backland first. Klein sighed and made a decision. He enveloped himself with spirituality and stimulated the descent, exiting the mysterious space above the grey fog. When he returned to the material world, he slowly walked out of his hiding spot towards Dunn Smith's grave. He stared deeply at the picture and epitaph. Klein slowly drew a crimson moon on his chest and walked out of the cemetery. As a former Netork who had to regularly patrol Raphael Cemetery, he was quite familiar with the routes of the guards, as well as surroundings. He managed to leave the cemetery easily, without causing any alarm. He followed the gravel road into Tingen, using the shade of the trees as cover. The night was peaceful and the moon was ever so dreamy. Klein walked alone, his thoughts running wild and unbridled. He sometimes considered his plan for revenge, sometimes thinking back to the times he spent with the captain, sometimes recalling old Neil's hidden grief beneath his humorous facade. Unknowingly, Klein had entered the nearest street like a wandering ghost, making his way past turn after turn. It was 2 hours later when he freed himself from that state and regained complete control of his thoughts. He realized that he was standing on Daffodil Street. Opposite him was the house he shared with his brother and sister. Instinctively, Klein had returned here. He took a step forward with clear joy, but suddenly paused. He let out a bitter smile and muttered with a self-deprecating tone, "If I went up and knocked on the door, Melissa might faint from shock. Benson would be so nervous his hair would start to drop. He would then try his best to calmly convince me, in the name of the curly-haired baboon." Shaking his head, Klein stared at the familiar door for a while before heading towards Iron Cross Street. This is fine too. The things that I do in the future will not implicate them. The compensation given to them by the Netork's team and the police department will be enough for them to live a stable middle-class life. Even if Melissa fails to find a job and Benson loses his job. Klein walked silently for a moment before starting to feel fatigue. But, as someone who was dead, he didn't have any other belongings on him except for the clothes he was wearing, his topaz pendulum, and Azik's copper whistle. He didn't have pounds, nor solly, nor pennies. Should I give the whistler blow to send a letter to Mr. Azik and get him to help me? Klein laughed optimistically. Forget it, I shouldn't contact him for the time being. Perhaps Zangwill is still keeping him under surveillance. I'll look for him when the time is right. To an old monster who has lived countless lives for thousands of years, he should be able to understand resurrection. At least it's not too cold tonight. I'll make do by finding a place to sleep for the time being and head to the Tingen branch of the Backland Bank tomorrow morning to retrieve the money in the anonymous account. As there have been too many things to do lately. Klein hadn't had the time to start on the experiments involving the sacrificial ritual. He hadn't touched the £300 in the anonymous account either. That should be enough to support my expenses for quite a while. I'll buy a newspaper tomorrow to confirm what day it is. Miss Justice and the others didn't make any new prayers. Which means that I didn't miss a gathering. Klein thought as he found a spot that had no wind. He sat down and took off his jacket. He used it as a blanket and leaned on the wall to sleep. It wasn't long into his sleep when he was suddenly woken by someone. He saw a policeman wielding a baton. He only had a single chevron on his epaulette. The lowest ranking police constable. Klein glanced at him to ascertain his identity. The policeman said fiercely, "You can't sleep here. The streets and parks aren't for you lazy, jobless vagrants to sleep in. Those are the terms in the poor law." Is that so? Klein froze. Given his sensitive identity, he didn't argue with the policeman. He grabbed his jacket and continued walking until daybreak. Soon after, he lowered his head and entered the Tingen branch of the Backland Bank. He took out £200 with the password he had set, leaving behind a third of the money as savings, in case of any emergencies. Without a doubt, Klein heard prayers when he wrote the password in ancient Hermes. Klein then spent £38 on 2 sets of formal wear, 2 shirts, 2 trousers, 2 pairs of leather boots, 2 bow ties, 4 pairs of socks, as well as 2 thick double-breasted jackets, 2 solid coloured fur coats, and 2 pairs of thick trousers in preparation for the winter. He also bought a cane, a wallet, and a leather luggage bag. After completing his purchase, Klein found a hotel to wash up and change in. He rented a private carriage directly to the train station in Tingen in order to avoid meeting anyone familiar. Along the way, he purchased a newspaper and discovered that was Sunday. It took about 4 hours to get from Tingen to Backlund by train. A luxurious first-class seat cost about 3/4 of a pound, or 15 solly. A second-class seat cost 10 solly, or half a pound. The packed, poorly maintained third-class seats were rather cheap at only 5 solly. Klein thought for a moment before buying a seat for the 2 o'clock train, a second-class seat. Klein found a random spot to sit in the waiting area with his ticket and luggage in hand. It was only slightly after 9 in the morning. He was happy that the Lowen Kingdom didn't have a strict census. He could prove his identity just by using the water and gas bills, as well as his rent for the past 3 months. Purchasing a train ticket was even easier, as all he needed was money. Klein suddenly had an empty feeling in his heart as he was sitting there, thinking about how he was about to leave for Backlund from Tingen in the afternoon. He thought about his sister, who always gave him a motherly vibe. He thought about his brother who liked to crack cold jokes. He thought about how they would fill their stomachs up so much that they wouldn't feel like moving. Recalling these scenes, Klein suddenly laughed. He laughed bitterly, for he thought about the tortoise that Melissa called a puppet, as well as Benson's pitiful hairline. He suddenly had a strong urge. He wanted to see his siblings again. At this moment, Klein suddenly realized why he hadn't picked an early train but instead bought a ticket for the 2 o'clock train. He carried his luggage and left the waiting area quickly, taking a rented carriage back to Daffodil Street. He then hid in a shady area on the opposite side and looked at the door to his house. There were many times when he felt like heading over, but he couldn't bring himself to cross the wide street. Klein looked across the road in a daze, suddenly having a feeling of homelessness. He had a similar feeling when he had just transmigrated. Suddenly, he saw the door to the house open as Melissa and Benson came out. Melissa was wearing a black dress and black veiled hat. Benson was in a shirt, vest, trousers, coat, and hat, all in black. They both had numb, sullen expressions. Melissa has become skinnier. Why is Benson so haggard? Klein's heart winced in pain. He opened his mouth but couldn't shout out their names. Without realizing it, he followed Benson and Melissa to the nearest municipal square. He saw that tents had been erected there again. A new circus troupe was in town for a performance. Benson took out some money and purchased the entrance tickets and led Melissa into the circus. He forced a smile. This circus troupe is very famous. Melissa nodded without expression. Okay. Suddenly, she slipped and almost fell. Klein, who was also buying a ticket, opened his mouth. He wanted to help his sister, but he could only retract the hand he had instinctively extended and stood helplessly in a busy crowd. Benson jumped in fright, but he was too late to help. However, Melissa quickly steadied herself. She puckered her lips and said nothing. At this moment, clowns swarmed forward, some performing balancing acts on wheels or large rubber balls, others tossing countless tennis balls into the air, then ridiculously catching every one of them. Melissa seemed to disregard the clowns as she looked at the performance. Benson tried to lift his sister's spirits by cheering, but he didn't succeed. He slowly turned sullen too. Klein puckered his lips tightly as he watched this scene from afar. He wanted to approach them, but he didn't dare to. Suddenly, he touched the wallet in his jacket and had an idea. Benson and Melissa continued walking forward, silently watching the various performances. Some time later, they saw a clown running towards them. His face was painted in colorful pastels. At first, he threw a tennis ball into the air, and, while the attention of the surrounding people was drawn to the air, he conjured a flower out of thin air. It was a Seville chrysanthemum. The clown brought the flower before Melissa and Benson. The flower was golden in color and symbolized happiness. Melissa and Benson looked at the clown in a daze. All they saw was a wide smile plastered over the pastel face. It was a happy smile, an exaggerated smile, a ridiculous smile. End of the first volume.